Bueno. So this morning, first of all, I'd like to welcome everyone here this morning. We're going to be speaking about the Word of God. The main text that we have this morning is Mark 11, 15 through 19. There are other related texts in Matthew 21, 12, 17, 19, 45 to 48, and John 2, 13 to 23. That is to say that this text, or the story that is contained in this text, is repeated in those references. The title of my sermon is, What Was He So Mad About? That's the title of the sermon. I'm going to repeat it. It is, What Was He So Mad About? Let's get right into it. Maybe some of you remember several years ago there was a campaign, a media campaign called WWJD. And the WWJD stood for What Would Jesus Do? It was started by a man from Holland, Michigan. His name was Don Seaborn. Don Seaborn is a traveling, non-denominational Christian evangelist. And he started this, I don't know if to call it ministry or to call it, what was he trying to do? But he went around, with this WWJD, and maybe some of you have had some rubber bands you could put on your wrist that would say WWJD. There were T-shirts, but it was all about, what would Jesus do in certain conditions. So there was another one that came later called FORG, and it stood for Fully Rely on God. And contrast to what Jesus would do, you can imagine the effectiveness of such a campaign would depend on the knowledge that the person employing knew about Jesus. So that is to say that if you ask somebody, what would Jesus do in this situation, the person would have to know who Jesus was in order to reply with any credibility. So if we agree there's some values to that campaign, understanding why he acted or reacted to certain situation, we could see the value of this campaign. I invite you in the next few minutes to analyze one of the most controversial, misunderstood, and confusing acts of Jesus in the Bible. I believe that this text we're going to read confuses a lot of people and is very controversial. This is a passage where we see Jesus being direct and passionate. And it leads us to a question, which is the topic of the sermon. What was he so mad about? Let's, first of all, talk about one point. Remember, we started talking about what would Jesus do. Well, in order to know what would Jesus do, we need to understand the context in which he was reacting. So we see Jesus reacting in a particular way. So in a way, it's related to our introduction of what would Jesus do. And so let's look around the topic of what was going on in that particular instance. So I'd invite somebody, I'm going to read it. Let's go to Mark 11, 15 to 19. Here's the verse. The verse in Mark 11:15 says, And they came to Jerusalem, and Jesus went into the temple, and began to cast them out that sold and bought in the temple, and overthrew the tables of the money changers, and the seats of them that sold doves, and would not suffer that any man should carry any vessel through the temple. And he thought, saying unto them, that is, he was teaching, saying unto them, It is not written, My house shall be called of all nations the house of prayer, but ye have made it a den of thieves. And the scribes and the chief priests heard it, and sought that they might destroy him, for they feared him, because all the people were astonished at his doctrine. And when even was come, he went out of the city. So here we have a very well-known verse about Jesus driving the money changers out of the temple. And it brings us back to this question, what was he so mad about? We see him flipping the tables of the money changers, pushing everybody out, and he wouldn't let anybody come into the temple with bringing anything into the temple. So let's take a look at the political situation. Well, there's some dispute about this. We don't have this in this text. You have to go into another text to see this. But we know that at this moment, right then and there, it was the time of the celebration of the Passover. So what's going on is, in the Passover, there were some rituals that they had to be performed. Now, there is a historical figure called Josephus. Josephus has helped us to understand a lot of different verses in the Bible, or the situations in the Bible. And he wrote that at one Passover feast, there were over 250,000 animals sacrificed. Okay? Can you imagine during the feast, they sacrificed 250,000 animals. Now, what was happening was people were coming from all around to come to Jerusalem. And when they came to the temple, a lot of the religious leaders and other business people saw a great opportunity to make some money. Because everybody at the end of the day had to go to the temple, so they set up shop in the temple to sell the animals that were required for the rites. So you see what's going on here? That the temple was converted into a business opportunity. And think about the business opportunity. 250,000 animals were sacrificed in one Passover celebration. Now, how do we know some of this stuff? One of the things is we can look at a blueprint of the temple. And if you look at the blueprint at the temple, it's very squarish. But at the entrance to your left, when you come in, there was an area set aside for all the nations to come, excuse me, to be able to worship God. So the entrance into the temple was not restricted to Jews only. Any person of any nation could come in with the purpose of worshiping God. So there was a part of the temple that was set aside for worshiping God, but it was set aside for people of different nations. What we know is from this verse is that they took that area, and that's where they were selling all the animals, the doves. They took over that area just to sell those animals. So another point of fact that we have from historical documents is that upwards to 2 million people would come into Jerusalem during the Passover feast. So I don't know if you've ever been to Soldier Field or to a Bears game, and when you get there, how much is a hot dog? $5. $7, $8. It's like $7 or $8 for a hot dog. So imagine when they have a big game and they're fully sold out. What are they looking to make money on? On the hot dog. The hot dog maybe costs 40 cents, but they're selling for $8, $9. That's the environment that was going on in the temple. There were people coming into Jerusalem. They needed those animals, because if they're coming from far, for them to be able to bring the animal all the way into Jerusalem and keep it in its pristine condition was very, very difficult. So to be able to get there and buy the animal there was very convenient. And everybody who was selling animals looked at it as a great opportunity to make money. And it's also the same situation that we have at Soldier Field, that when there's a big game and they're selling the hot dogs at $8, when a hot dog really costs what? 40 cents. So the profit margin is great. So that's one thing that's going on. Now, we see the temple as being an opportunity for them to make money. Now, they also just got permission to rebuild the temple. So they needed money to build the temple. So when you went into the temple, you couldn't just walk in. You had to pay a temple what? Tax. So here's another place that you could make money. Now, there were two separate, what we call theological groups. There was one group that was in charge of all the different synagogues in the area in Jerusalem. And then there was another group that was in charge of the temple. Now, these two groups were kind of fighting with each other. They didn't really like each other. They didn't have the exact same theology. So the group that was in the temple got its money from the taxes for coming into the temple. When people came to you can imagine when people came to buy things in the temple, they would get a little piece of the profit. Okay, so that's the political or theological situation in which we find ourselves. So you see at the end of the verse, let's go back to verse. If you look at verse 18, it says, "And the scribes and the chief priests heard it, and they sought how they might destroy him, for they feared him, because of all the people who were astonished at his doctrine." So here you have two factions. They were fighting each other. But when they heard what he did in the temple, both of them became united with the purpose of killing Christ. See, before, Christ would go in the synagogue and make them angry. And the people that were in charge, the Sanhedrin, that were in charge of the temple, they were happy because Christ was making them what? Upset. But when he came into their temple and made them upset, they both united together with the purpose of what? As the verse says, to what? Destroy him. So here you have this political dynamic that is changing because of what Christ did in the temple. And he understood the dynamics of it. He understood what happens when he goes into a synagogue and what was happening when he went to the temple. So here we have all these artifacts around the decision of what Jesus did. Okay. Now, the thing that confuses or causes some people to be uncomfortable was what Jesus did when he went in the temple. He actually drove people out. He used physical violence to push people out of the temple. A lot of people read that and they said, well, that couldn't be true because Jesus wasn't being humble. And what happens is, a lot of people miss the interpretation of being humble with being meek. Being meek and being humble are not the same thing. The significance of the temple established that the temple had one intent, that it was a place to worship him, and it was speaking of God. Jesus' posture shows us that the Father is very passionate about our access to him through prayer and worship. And in any incursion on this access would flare God's anger. So what we're seeing here is Christ reacting to his Father's sensitivities. He knows that God doesn't want anybody to inhibit our ability to go to him and to worship him. So what we're seeing here is Christ reacting to that sensitivity. There should be no confusion about Jesus' aggressiveness disposition towards God's temple and our ability to have